I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and imagine something with me. Imagine that you live in a city that has been standing for over 1,000 years. Not a city that was founded 1,000 years ago and then rebuilt and reinvented a dozen times over, but a city whose walls have physically, literally, never been breached. A city that has watched empires rise and collapse around it. A city that has survived plague, civil war, naval blockades, and at least a dozen serious military sieges, and has come through every single one of them intact. A city whose survival has become, over a millennium, something that people have stopped questioning. Not because they are naive, but because the evidence of 1,000 years suggests that this city simply does not fall. Now imagine that it is April of 1453, and something is different this time. You can hear it from the walls. A sound that nobody in this city has ever heard before at this scale. The thunder of cannons, firing and firing and firing, all day, every day, against walls that were built for a different kind of war entirely. Walls that have held for 1,000 years are beginning, section by section, to crack. That is where we are going today, and I need you to stay with me through every part of this, because the story of how Constantinople fell in May of 1453 is not just a military history. It is not just a story about sieges and cannons and Ottoman strategy. It is a story about what happens at the end of a 1,000-year era, about the last days of a civilization that had outlasted everything thrown at it, finally meeting the one thing it could not survive. And it is a story whose consequences, I would argue, you are still living with today, whether you know it or not. Let's go back. To understand what was actually lost in May of 1453, you have to understand what Constantinople was. Not what it had been at its absolute peak, because by 1453, it was no longer at its peak, and we need to be honest about that. But what it still was, physically and symbolically, in the spring of the year it fell. The city sat at one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the entire planet. A peninsula jutting into the water at the point where Europe and Asia come closest to touching, where the Bosphorus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, where any ship moving between those two bodies of water had to pass within sight of its walls. The Romans had understood this when Constantine the Great chose the site in 330 AD and built his new imperial capital there. The geography alone made the city almost impossible to attack from the sea, and the famous Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century and running for miles across the landward side of the peninsula, had made it nearly impossible to attack from land as well. Inside those walls, in the spring of 1453, the physical architecture of a great imperial past was still visible and still functioning. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 AD under Emperor Justinian, its dome a feat of engineering so audacious that the architects reportedly had no mathematical framework sufficient to explain why it was staying up, remained the largest cathedral in the Christian world. 916 years old and still in use, still holding services, still, by every account of the period, genuinely astonishing to anyone who walked through its doors for the first time. Le Meze, the city's great central avenue, ran marble-paved and broad through the heart of the city, connecting its major public squares and passing through markets that still sold fresh fish from the Bosphorus, olives and wine from the surrounding countryside, and spices that had traveled the length of the Mediterranean trade network. The city's administration still functioned, its courts still heard cases, its scholars still worked. But here is what you also need to understand. By 1453, Constantinople was a city in serious, visible, undeniable decline. A century of recurring plague, beginning with the catastrophic Black Death in 1347, which hit Constantinople as hard as anywhere in Europe, had reduced the population from what had once been perhaps 500,000 people to somewhere between 50 and 100,000. Large sections within the famous Theodosian walls, sections that had once been packed with buildings and streets and the dense life of an imperial capital, had reverted to open fields and vegetable gardens and orchards. The Byzantine Empire itself, the eastern continuation of Rome that had kept Roman governance alive for nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed, had contracted to almost nothing. The city itself, a scattering of Aegean islands, and a territory in the Peloponnese called the Despotate of Morea. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia now consisted, essentially, of a single city. And that city knew it. This is the context that makes what the defenders did in the spring of 1453 so remarkable. They were not defending a great empire with resources to draw on and allies who could be counted on to arrive. They were defending a memory of an empire with almost nothing against an opponent who had spent the previous year preparing specifically and methodically for this moment. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old when his army appeared on the hills outside Constantinople in early April of 1453. 21. An age at which most people are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives. He had come to power at 19, had made the conquest of Constantinople the central strategic and symbolic objective of his reign from the moment he took the throne, and had spent the winter of 1452 to 1453 preparing with a methodical thoroughness that is, even at this distance in time, genuinely impressive. He had overseen the construction of Rumeli Hisar, a massive fortress built on the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait in just 4 months during the summer of 1452, a construction project that would be considered ambitious today and was extraordinary in the 15th century. The fortress, positioned at the narrowest point of the strait, effectively cut off Constantinople's ability to receive supplies from the Black Sea. Before the siege formally began, Mehmed had already strangled the city's supply lines. He had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a cannon founder who had initially approached the Byzantine court offering his services, had been turned away because Constantine's treasury could not meet his price, and had then taken his skills to the Ottomans, who very much could, to design and cast a series of artillery pieces unlike anything that had been used in European warfare before. The largest of Orban's cannons was approximately 8 meters in length. It fired stone projectiles weighing around 270 kilograms. It could hurl those projectiles over distances exceeding 1 kilometer. It took a team of 60 oxen and several hundred men to move it into position. When fired, it required approximately 3 hours to cool before it could be reloaded and fired again. 3 hours between shots sounds like a limitation, and it was. But Mehmed didn't rely on a single cannon. He positioned multiple artillery pieces along the land wall, staggering their firing so that the bombardment was sustained and continuous across different sections of the wall simultaneously. The cumulative effect of that sustained, coordinated artillery fire on walls that had been built for an era of battering rams and siege towers, walls that had never been designed to absorb the concussive force of gunpowder artillery, was something that nobody inside Constantinople had a historical framework for understanding, because nothing like this had ever happened to these walls before. When the Ottoman army appeared in early April, modern historians estimate the force at between 50 and 80,000 soldiers, supported by a naval fleet of approximately 125 vessels. The defenders inside the city had a total of roughly 7,000 men. 7,000 against a minimum of 50,000. The ratio was somewhere between 7 and 11 to 1, depending on which estimates you use, and in either case,
It is a ratio that should have made the outcome obvious within days.
It didn't. And understanding why it didn't is the part of this story that tends to get lost when people focus only on the dramatic ending. The man most responsible for the defense holding as long as it did was not the emperor. It was a Genoese military commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who arrived in Constantinople in January of 1453 with 700 trained soldiers, having responded to Emperor Constantine's appeals for military assistance from the west. Giustiniani was, by every contemporary account, exactly the kind of commander you want when you are defending a long perimeter with limited forces against a vastly superior opponent. He understood walls. He understood how to position defenders for maximum effect. He understood that the key to holding a defensive perimeter is not distributing your forces evenly along its length, but concentrating them at the points of greatest vulnerability and responding rapidly when those points come under pressure. He took personal command of the land wall defense and immediately identified the most dangerous section, the Mesoteikion, the middle stretch of the wall running along the valley of the Lycus River, where the terrain gave attackers a slight advantage and the walls were marginally less robust than elsewhere. This is where Giustiniani concentrated his best troops. This is where he spent most of his waking hours during the 7 weeks that followed. Constantine had also taken a precaution that proved enormously effective in the opening weeks of the siege. He sealed the entrance to the Golden Horn, the inlet of water that formed the city's northern harbour, with a massive iron chain stretched across the water on floating wooden logs. The chain prevented Mehmed's naval fleet from entering the harbour and attacking the city from the north, effectively limiting the Ottoman naval threat to the open waters of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, where the geography was less favourable for a direct assault. The bombardment began in earnest on April 6th. The sound, according to contemporary accounts, was audible for miles. The ground shook with each shot. Stone projectiles weighing 1/4 of a metric ton hit the ancient walls and left damage that was, at first, startling to everyone who saw it, including the Ottoman gunners who had not previously had an opportunity to test Orban's largest cannon against a real target at this scale. Sections of the outer wall cracked, sections collapsed. Rubble filled the defensive ditches in front of the walls, which was itself a problem, because those ditches were part of the defensive system. The Theodosian walls were not a single wall, but a layered system of outer and inner walls, with a defended space between them. And the rubble was degrading that system. Constantine responded by organizing overnight repair teams. Every night, as the artillery fell silent and the Ottoman forces stood down, teams of carpenters, masons, and civilian volunteers worked through the darkness to repair the damage done during the day. They worked with timber, rubble, earth, whatever materials were at hand. The repairs were not elegant. They were not the kind of fortifications that would have survived a sustained assault on their own. But they were enough to present a defensible obstacle again by the following morning, when the bombardment resumed. This nightly cycle, bombardment during the day, frantic repair through the night, bombardment again at dawn, continued for most of April. And the walls held. Not because they were undamaged. They were significantly damaged and getting more damaged every day. They held because of the repair teams working through the dark, and because Giustiniani's defenders were meeting every Ottoman infantry assault that followed a bombardment with crossbow fire and dropped materials from the parapets. And because the defenders of Constantinople had something that is easy to overlook when you are looking at the numbers. They had fought from these walls before, and they knew every inch of them. By the 3rd week of April, Mehmed understood that the direct bombardment approach was not going to produce a quick result. The walls were damaged, but holding. The defenders were exhausted, but organized. He needed to open additional pressure points. And what he did next was one of the most audacious logistical operations of the 15th century. On April 22nd,
Ottoman forces executed a plan that the defenders inside the city had considered essentially impossible.
They hauled approximately 70 ships overland. Not small boats, warships, galleys, substantial vessels, dragged out of the Bosphorus on the southern side of the Galata promontory, hauled on greased wooden slipways across the hill, and relaunched into the Golden Horn on the northern side, bypassing the Iron Chain entirely, bringing a naval force inside the harbour that the chain had been specifically designed to prevent from entering. The psychological impact on the defenders was considerable. They had believed the chain made the northern approach secure. The chain was still in place, intact, unbroken. It simply no longer mattered, because the ships were on the other side of it. Constantine and his Venetian and Genoese naval commanders organized an immediate counter-operation. On the night of April 28th, fire ships were sent into the Golden Horn to destroy the newly positioned Ottoman fleet before it could be used to support an assault on the northern walls. The operation was detected. Ottoman forces were waiting. The fire ships were driven off, and several of the attacking crews were killed or captured. The attempt failed completely. Now the defenders faced a second front. The northern walls along the Golden Horn, which had previously required minimal garrison because the chain secured the harbour, now needed defenders that the garrison could not spare from the land walls. And underground, a third contest was simultaneously underway. That thread was cut on May 29th, 1453. And what happened immediately afterward, in the months and years following the fall, is where this story stops being only about Constantinople and starts being about the world that we actually live in. The fall of Constantinople did not cause the Renaissance. The Renaissance was already underway in Italy, had been developing for decades, and would have continued regardless of what happened in 1453. But the fall of Constantinople significantly accelerated and deepened it in ways that historians have documented carefully. Greek scholars had been leaving Constantinople for decades as the situation deteriorated and the Ottoman threat became increasingly clear. They brought manuscripts with them, texts by Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and dozens of other ancient writers that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries and that Western Europe had either lost entirely or knew only through incomplete translations. After 1453, the flow became a flood. Scholars who had remained in Constantinople until the end departed with whatever they could carry. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek scholar who had converted to Catholicism and settled in Rome years before the fall, spent decades after 1453 collecting Greek manuscripts and depositing them in what would become the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, one of the most important collections of ancient texts in the world, assembled largely from the wreckage of Byzantine intellectual culture. The manuscripts these scholars carried west contained knowledge and frameworks that fed directly into the scientific and philosophical revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries. The connection between the fall of Constantinople and the acceleration of the Renaissance is not a metaphor. It is a documented transfer of specific texts and specific knowledge from a civilization that was ending to one that was just beginning to find its direction. The other consequence was more immediate and more economically concrete, and it is one that most American students of history encounter without ever being told the full context. When the Ottomans took control of Constantinople and the surrounding trade routes in 1453, and then extended that control to additional points along the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea trade networks in the years that followed, the overland and sea routes that European merchants had used to access the spice trade, the routes that carried pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg from South and Southeast Asia through the Middle East and into Mediterranean ports, became dramatically more expensive to use and less reliable to depend on. This was not primarily because the Ottomans blocked the routes. They largely didn't. Trade continued because the Ottomans benefited from taxing it. But the geopolitical situation created enough uncertainty and enough additional cost that the major trading powers of Western Europe, Venice, Genoa, Portugal, Spain, began investing seriously in the search for alternative routes to Asia, routes that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean entirely. Portugal had been working on this problem for decades, sending expeditions progressively further down the African coast under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator. The urgency intensified after 1453. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that a sea route from Europe to Asia around Africa was physically possible. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain looking for Asia and found the Americas instead. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the first direct sea voyage from Europe to India around Africa. The Age of Exploration, the series of voyages that connected the previously isolated hemispheres of the globe, that established European colonial presence across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, that created the first genuinely global economy, and that set the course of the next 5 centuries of world history, was not caused solely by the fall of Constantinople, but it was significantly accelerated by it. The economic pressure created by Ottoman control of the eastern trade routes was one of the primary motivations driving the investment in oceanic exploration that produced those voyages. The world you live in, the Americas as they exist, the global economic system as it functions, the particular distribution of languages and religions and political systems across the continents, is shaped in ways that go deeper than most people realize by what happened on the morning of May 29th, 1453, when an unlocked gate in a wall in Constantinople was pushed open and a 1,000-year empire ended.